Hi everyone, Richard Salcedo here. I want to do a quick example of some scoring for smaller bands. I know some folks that ask about that, and a couple people seemed a little frustrated with trying to get their bands scored correctly, and I can certainly appreciate that. I've certainly been there, done that. So I wanted to give a couple of suggestions by comparing 8 bars that I wrote for a large band and then taking those 8 bars and rescoring them for a small band and giving you some suggestions where we don't lose any of the sonority, quality, or resonance within the scoring. So, first of all, I want you to listen to both of these, and then we'll go back and talk about them just for a second. Okay, I'm hoping that everybody can hear these okay, because I'm just going to play them through my speakers. All right, here we go. Okay, so hopefully you heard that. And the thing that I'm hoping the most is that you didn't hear a whole lot of difference between the two. Now, let me point out a couple of things that I did here, and hopefully this will give you some starting points and some suggestions for scoring for your smaller groups. So if we take these first 8 measures that are on the left side of my screen here, and we rescore them for small band, the first biggest obstacle is going to be how in the world are we going to get that woodwind effect with all those triplets going on? Well, the first thing, if you look at that woodwind effect carefully, and I know it's hard to see because it's kind of small up here on the screen, but you'll notice that it's kind of a little bit of a smoke and mirrors thing where in each line, piccolo, flute 1, flute 2, clarinet 1, clarinet 2, clarinet 3, those lines are all split between a part that goes dia-da-da, 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 which of course is way more playable. And then the bottom part of that line has da, dia-da-da, 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 and you put it together and you know what we get. Dia-da-dia-da, dia-da-dia-da, dia-da-dia-da-da. Okay? So with even bigger bands, okay, it doesn't mean that they necessarily always have the technique, all right, to handle all that. So we make that a little bit more realistic by doing that there. Now, how are we going to do that with a small band that may only have a few flutes and clarinets, period? Maybe an alto or a tenor. Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're not going to think about putting that in woodwinds. It doesn't mean that you couldn't. It'll depend on your numbers. But as you look at the small band scoring, I'm kind of looking at this as that we're talking about a group that might have 3 flutes, maybe 3 or 4 clarinets, a couple of altos, a tenor sax, maybe 2 or 3 trumpets, couple of baritones, trombones, and a tuba. All right. Hopefully they have a percussion section where they can at least do snare, tenor, bass. Or if they don't have enough to do that, as Tony was suggesting the other day, you might just want to have a mallet group or a front ensemble. You could have it behind the band. You could have it in front of the band. But I would probably suggest if that's the group you're going to have, you might want to put them behind the group. Anyway. All right, so what I'm going to suggest then is that we take all that crazy woodwind stuff and we put it in a mallet part. And if you're lucky enough to have a piano player, we can put it in the right hand of the piano as well. Now, let's say all you have is 2 marimba players. All right, so you could put those marimba players and you could layer them just like I did the woodwinds, where one of them is playing ba-ba-da-beep, ba-ba-da-bum, 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 and then someone could play the bottom part, bum, da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, down the octave. Okay, now if you're lucky enough to have 2 instruments, there you go. You know, you want to have them up in the higher register so they're going to speak a little bit, and you can go from there. You could do a couple of other things too. If you have a bell player and a vibe player, you know, you could have the bell player play the top part really gently. You could have the vibe player play the lower part with not so much ring or pedal used, and maybe a little harder mallet so that it sounds a little closer to the bells so you can get that same effect. But the main idea here, guys, is that the hardest part, this triplet part, no one is moving while they're playing it. All right, so we're setting up kids more for success. And if a smaller group can pull off this dia-da-dia-da-dia-da-dia-da-dum, it's going to be impressive, and you're going to make a huge impact on people. So you want to make sure that's in the hands of the players that could do it. Now, another thing you could do also, if you wanted to, I'm going a little bit off the norm here and outside the box, but if you had a couple of really good woodwind players, you could have them on a mic doing the opposite parts. Have one of them playing the top part, have one of them playing the bottom part. Okay, so there's a lot of ways to get this effect without putting strain on your players that are out on the field. All right, now, if you are lucky enough to have a keyboard player, a piano player, you can do that, but not necessary, because if you have a mallet player or two, you don't need the keyboard part. Now, here's the part that if I had this size of band, this is what I would definitely do. If you look down the score, you're going to see an organ part. And it has left hand and right hand. And basically what the left hand is playing is the bass line. To help reinforce the bass line, you may only have one tuba, or you know what? You may not have a tuba. Or you may be lucky to have one bass clarinet. So the left hand of organ would support that bass clarinet. You may have a bari sax. The left hand of organ would support the bari sax. All right? The right hand is basically playing the chords that support all of this melody in this entire segment. All right? So even if you don't have a lot of people to play the accompaniment, if you just put like a beautiful low brass sound, or you could even use an organ sound behind this, all that matters is that we hear all the chords really clearly. Now listen to what the organ part by itself sounds like. And we're talking about one person. And if you look at the organ part, it's not hard. It's really, really easy. All they need to do is know how to work the sustain pedal so it doesn't sound choppy. All right. And the parts are very, very simple. If you have a player that has small hands, you might want to even condense the right hand chords a little bit more. But the bottom line is you'll hear the chords. So check this out. This is just the organ part. Let me play that one more time for you because I didn't have my volume up. Here again is the organ part. All right, so what we're saying, if we look at this small band scoring issue, is if we have a couple of mallet players that can handle this technical part, and remember, all they have to do is either go ba-da-da-da, dee-da-da-dum, or ba-da-da-da-dee-da-da-da. All right, so you've got that part covered. You got a piano player that can do it in the right hand, you're even more in business. All right, if you have 3 or 4 mallet players that can do that, you're really in business. Okay, now, if we put the mallet parts, and I also put a contrabass part in here too, a bass player, if you happen to have a bass player. But again, if you have a good organ player and they can handle that left hand part, which of course is not hard, you really don't need the bass player. Now, if you have a bass player in this particular kind of piece, you wouldn't want it to be like a rock bass or a jazz bass. You'd want it to be like an arco bass, like an orchestral bass would sound. All right, so now listen what happens when we play just the organ part, the contrabass part, and the mallet parts. And we'll even throw timpani in there just for the heck of it. And if you don't have a timpani player, guess what? Don't need it because the organ part's covering it. But if you do, more power to you. Let's check it out. So So you can see right there with just one person on organ, a couple people on mallets. Again, if you're lucky enough to have 3 or 4 people on mallets, awesome. If you have a piano player that can play that right hand and left hand part too, that's great. Okay, if you have a couple woodwind players that can come up and join them with that, and you still have some woodwind players left on the field to play the melody, you're even in better shape. But listen how full that sounded just because of that one person organ. All right. Now, I wouldn't recommend that a big band do this because they don't need to do that. However, let me tell you, a lot of big bands do it just to reinforce their sound and make them even sound even bigger. But for a small band, you want to set up your kids for success. And if every time they played on the field, they felt that richness and fullness of that accompaniment behind them, I think they'd be really confident. Now let's look at the wind parts, so I don't keep you too long here. All right, very simply, I'm assuming you have no piccolos and just a few flutes. Flutes would be on the melody. It's in a really good range for them. All right, let's say you have 2 or 3 clarinets, and maybe you're lucky enough to have one player who's really, really good. All right, so I did this in octaves. So if they're not so strong, they can play the lower octave. Everything's basically in the staff or right below the staff. If they're a great player, let them have fun going up to high E flat here, etc., high B flat and C here. And if you don't have those players, you don't have to use it. Just use the lower part. The alto part works perfectly range-wise. And you can see, and even if you just have a couple altos, that'll work. If you have a tenor sax, it seems like every band has a tenor sax. This will work, and what I did, I did some octave displacement in through here, so they're not playing real low or real high. The highest we went is the high C here, okay? But now check out what our melody people are doing. And let's imagine that there's maybe 3 or 4 flutes, 3 or 4 clarinets, let's say 3 altos and a tenor. So, you know, maybe we have at the most 10 woodwind players playing here. Let's check it out. All right, so you can sense that there's power in there, and the reason that there's power is because we're hearing the melody played in octaves. Okay, obviously there's a difference from that lower clarinet part to the flute part. There's an octave, which gives us power. Okay, there's an octave between that upper clarinet part and the alto sax part. There's obviously some octave difference between the tenor sax and the alto sax. All right, sometimes they line up, but sometimes they're an octave difference. That gives us more power. Now, let's say you had a second synthesizer that you could use, or a second keyboard player, or you had a keyboard player, but you didn't want them on this part up here. You could have them on the melody. Okay, no problem. But I think this melody will cut if it's scored this way, even if it's only like 10 players that are playing it. Okay, now let's look at the accompanying parts. I'm going to assume that you have maybe 2 or 3 trumpets, couple baritones, trombones, and a tuba. All right. Notice I'm not even assuming that you have a mellophone. The good news here is if you do have an F horn of any kind, your choice. Okay. You can put them on some harmony parts. You can put them on the melody. Okay. If they're crazy good, put them on the triplet part. Why not? You know, feature them a little bit out there. Okay. I wouldn't recommend that, but you could try it if they're really, really good. You know, if like they're sick good, then I would do that. But then you could also, you know what else you could do? You could hold them on a sustain, maybe some simple movement, give them their own independent line through there. All right, as long as it's playable and all this. So you can see that everything that the winds are doing, guys, is very marchable, very playable. You want to make sure they're staged in a way that we're going to hear these parts. Now let's listen to the accompanying parts. And let's imagine that this is maybe 8 brass, maybe, I don't know, 7 or 8 brass at the most. Now I want you to notice one more thing that I did through here. I made sure that our trumpets get rest. Okay? Our trombones don't tend to need rest as much as our trumpets do. All right, but I even gave them a minute to take a breath in here. Same thing with the tubas, etc. All right. But you always want to, especially in small groups, you want to make sure your players are rested when they come back in. All right. So now we've got a group with a couple people on mallet parts or maybe a piano part playing this crazy tuplet part. We have our organ supporting the chords behind everything. And again, I would probably put this group, if you don't have a battery especially, or even if you have just 1 or 2 battery players, I would probably put them behind the band in a setting. Okay, if you've ever watched Tarpon Springs Band, they do a great job of putting stuff behind the band, and then the band listens back to stay in time. All right, so I think this is pretty realistic for small groups. Check it out now. This is the entire, I'll let you listen to both of them again, right back to back. So here's the large band scoring version, and then the small band scoring version. Here we go. Small band. Okay, guys, and of course, I'm using this from my experience being around smaller groups, and I've been around a lot of them. And this is the way that I'd score for them. And I think this is very, very realistic. If you look at this and you even say, hey, Richard, this high G is too tough for my trumpets, then guess what? We take this G down to the D, we take this D down to the G in the staff. There's always a way to make it work. You want to make it comfortable for your players, and that's not going to affect the orchestration at all. We'll still hear the chord just fine. All right? So if you have questions, let me know, but I hope this helps a little bit, and I hope it answers some of the questions that you had about small band scoring. All right? Thanks so much for watching, guys.